we are over 2,000. Now, I do want to do a Jobava London game or two with the white pieces because I did release that course, and I'm not doing this to shill it out. I just want people to be aware of this opening and to be aware of the work that I did on it. So if we get white, we're going to do a Jobava London. If we get black, we're going to do our standard stuff. So since the YouTube video starts right now, I'm just going to repeat what I said to my Twitch stream, which is that one or two games, I want to do a Jobava London, kind of introduce all of you to the basics. I have a course on the Jobava London that is out and now updated with more extensive text annotations. Link will be in the description. I promise I won't keep mentioning it. We're actually just going to play a game. So the Jobava London is an opening we've already played exactly once on the speedrun. We tried to play it a couple games ago, but we faced d4, g6, and there the most sensible option, the most principled option is to play e4. This is the starting position of the Jobava London. This is what you're going to get probably 75 to 80% of the time, at least, at most levels, when you play d4 and knight c3. Most people know to play d5 here. Otherwise, black risks getting move ordered into a French or a perk. So a lot of people, they go g6 or they pre-move, and then white plays e4. And typically, most people don't play the perk. So, black already gets move ordered. So our opponent taking his time, trying to figure out what he wants to play. And g6 is on the board. This is the line that most King's Indian and Grunfeld players end up choosing because it is the most similar. I mean, it is essentially a Grunfeld setup in the sense that black plays all the Grunfeld moves, right? d5, knight f6, and g6. Of course, in contrast to the Grunfeld, our pawn is not on c4. And this leads to a fundamentally different type of game. Here, the idea is incredibly tactical. So Bortnyk and I, when we were preparing the course, we checked a couple of different setups here. And we came to the conclusion that the most testing and the one that causes the most problems to g6 players involves quickly pushing up the h-pawn, which sounds like, something you'd play in a bullet game or some sort of gimmicky line. But in fact, it poses very serious practical problems. Arjun Erigaisi has played this in OTB chess. He's beaten all of the top players with this setup. And it's legitimately annoying. So don't think of this as some sort of gimmicky, a line that you could play in one game. This is a forever type of idea. And after e3, we immediately start running the h-pawn up the board with the move h2, h4. And if you're not experienced in this position or with this idea, which does reoccur, by the way, in several different openings, I'll show you some examples of an early h-pawn push, which is legitimate. For example, in the Dutch, one of the best lines involves quickly pushing the h-pawn. We do want to play h5 and sacrifice the exchange on h5, and I'll expand on that afterward. Our opponent has played the main move, which is h5, immediately stopping the progress of our pawn. Now, we respond by continuing our development, and I'm not going to take too much time here to illustrate the moves. I'll do that mostly after the game. We play knight f3. What I will say is that it appears that the situation on the king's side is completely frozen. Like, after black castles, which he just did, there will never, ever be any chances to attack. But that's actually not true. Sooner rather than later, sooner than you might think, we will be in a position where we will be able to play the typical move g4, try to force black's pawn off of h5, and then push our own pawn forward to h5. Another incredibly common attacking technique that you could see in a Sicilian. You see this in Dragons very often, where white just throws the kitchen sink at black, and the only idea is to open up as many files and diagonals as possible, and then the pieces essentially infiltrate. Now, in this position, again, there are a couple of options. There's knight to b5, inducing knight a6. There's knight to e5. But Sasha and I settled on a move that prepares long castle, which is ultimately where we're going to castle. We have a pawn on h4. So rarely in the g6 line do you castle short. It's not unprecedented. But 95% of the time, you castle to the queen side. And you get a fascinating game, opposite side castling, attacks on opposite sides. And our claim is that white's attack is simply more effective. And not necessarily is the game going to be decided by an attack. Just as likely that the game is decided by, a battle in the center of the board. And that seems likely given our opponent's last move, c5. So c5 is a typical move in most queen's pawn openings. And it's particularly sensible here because we have a knight on c3. So in the regular London system, you often meet c5 with c3. Here, we can't solidify the pawn quite as effectively. But there is, on the other hand, a major benefit to developing the knight to c3, which is that the knight, of course, aims at the d5 pawn, and very often c5 is simply met with d takes c5. And that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to take this pawn. We're going to take this pawn, And you might say, well, aren't we giving away, central control? And we are to an extent, but the pawn on d5 is now under very serious fire. And we can actually capture it on this move. Knight b7. Our opponent seems very, very confident. I have to actually remember if this is the line. This is, I will put it this way, a lot more theory than most people at this level tend to reproduce. No, I'm pretty sure we can take this other pawn. Oh, but then black takes and goes bishop takes b2. Wait a second. Let me think about this for a second. Knight bd7. I hope I didn't mess it up already. Which, by the way, I will do very often. Even though I did the course, it doesn't mean I remember everything all the time. And I'm not ashamed to admit that. Nobody does. So we could play knight takes d5, but then the problem is black plays knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and bishop takes b2. And then after we move our rook, it's a complicated position, but black can drop back to c3 with the bishop, so I'm not enthralled by that option. There's also b4, but b4 runs into the tactical knight e4. And then we lose, at the very least, I think, an exchange on a1, which is not appealing at all. I think d takes e5 might have been wrong, but let's see if we can make the most out of this. Knight a4, there's again knight e4. Wow. Clearly our opponent has studied this very, very carefully. And it's not the end of the world. I mean, even after we allow knight takes c5, it's fine. It's not like black is winning or anything. And one of the typical setups in this line of the Jobava basically involves moving this knight away from f3. So playing a move like knight to e5. And then basically putting the pawn up to f3 in order to prepare the idea that I had mentioned previously. Let's give that a shot. Let's play knight e5. Let's play knight e5. I'm assuming our opponent will take on c5, because that seems to be the only sensible move. He probably has my course. That's entirely possible. I'll have to check the course. I mean, c5 is definitely analyzed. There's just so many lines that we've looked at that I pretty often get confused. And I will ultimately study the course more carefully myself. Okay, knight takes c5. Our knight is nicely positioned in the center, but now the second component of that move is to play the move f3. Just a second. And f3 is played for two primary reasons. The most important is that we are preparing an eventual g2, g4, and h4, h5, and I'll show you some if we don't get to carry this out during the game, I'll show you some examples of how effective this can be in this line. The second is a more positional reason. We are controlling the e4 square. So we are not permitting either of black's knights to jump into e4, which would be very, very unpleasant, and you should kind of intuitively understand that. Knight e4 was a serious threat, positionally at least. So we're trying to restrict the mobility of the knights. And it's important to understand that, yes, black has superior central control, but that's not necessarily a good thing, because the pawn on d5 is a serious target. And by castling queenside, we're also adding an attacker on the d5 pawn. So the position is incredibly sharp. And we have found through our investigation of most online games that people they struggle in a lot of different types of Jobava positions because they're unconventional. And that's one of the biggest perks of playing this opening. It leads to fresh positions where people are lost at sea. Like, the usual principles just do not apply in many types of positions. So you can that's why you can score so many really quick victories. Okay, bishop f5. So in many of these lines, bishop f5 is in fact met with g4. H takes g4 and h5. And that's a risky idea. It's an interesting idea. We could try it. I'd have to calculate it for a bit. The alternative is to play it safe and simply castle queenside. Castle queenside and continue our development and go after the d5 pawn, and then maybe play g4 on the next move. Is bishop e2? Yeah, bishop e2, of course, is a candidate move to prepare g4. But bishop e2 is a little bit passive. I think bishop e2 is a little bit passive. We often don't need to play bishop e2 because the point of g4, we're happy to sacrifice a pawn. Actually, we want to sacrifice a pawn because that opens up the files. Give me 30 seconds to make this decision. Bishop e2 also, by the way, very much on the table. Okay, as much as I know the tactics Andes among you want us to play g4, I think it's premature. I think it's way premature. It might work. It might work, but this is not what I want to promote on the speedrun, right? I don't want to make gimmicky moves that, that set traps unless we're losing. So let's castle. So we're threatening the pawn. I mean, we are threatening to play knight takes d5, and we will take that pawn if given the opportunity. Of course, it's a little bit dangerous because this bishop is X-raying the b2 pawn, and we have to be very, very careful. We have to be very careful because the knight on e5 is also not supported by a pawn, which means it's a little bit more vulnerable. So potentially if black moves the knight away from f6, basically we have to react carefully to whatever our opponent does. And we have to super carefully identify not only the immediate threats, but also the potential tactical patterns. For instance, if black plays in this position queen b6, which probably might be the best move, I don't know. That move in itself does not create any immediate threats, but it aims at the b2 pawn. So later on, if our knight is gone from e5 and our knight is gone from c3, we have to be especially careful about tactics involving like a mate on b2. And when you have opposite side castling, those two processes have to always happen. You have to identify the short-term threats and then understand how each of your opponent's move impacts the sort of long-term tactical patterns, because that helps you nip things in the bud before you blunder them. Yeah, of course it's risky. Like what we're doing is risky, but it's fun and it teaches you a lot about tactical positions, and it's just not easy for black to play this type of structure. We don't have to play g4 in the neck. Okay, bishop e6. So that's a bit of a passive move. I actually like to see this move. This move is music to my ears, because not only does it not accentuate the attack on the queen side, it essentially loses a move and it takes the e6 square away from the knight, which could have dropped back to e6 in certain cases. So once again, this increases the appeal of the move g4, which is now very, very tempting for me. It's still incredibly double-edged, but it feels to me that now that we've shepherded our king to safety, it's a good time to consider the move g4. We just smash through in the king side, and this is the kind of move that, you know, a GM might play without calculating that many variations, because our attack, in my experience analyzing this line of the Jobava, has convinced me that in so many positions, g4, h5 just works. All right, it just opens up a bunch of files. And then our queen from d2, this is a crucial follow-up idea. Once we play g4, our queen has direct access to the h file. So when the h file opens up, queen h2 could automatically create an unstoppable mate threat on h7. So we could still play this positionally. We could play king b1, but let's go for it. Let's play in the spirit of the Jobava London. Let's try g4, and let's see what happens. And hopefully black takes. Of course, black could also ignore, which might be the best thing black could do here. Well, maybe we had time for bishop. I actually dislike bishop e2 because it closes off the avenue for the queen. All right, so bishop e2 actually could end up being counterproductive. I actually would not take on g4 here with black. I will say I would not take on g4 here. But that's a very advanced thing to do, to not take this pawn and to realize that, in fact, black is stable on the king side for the time being. We're not threatening anything. G5 is not really a threat. It forces the knight away, maybe wins the d5 pawn. Definitely g takes h5 is not a threat, because then the knight recaptures. And that's also counterproductive because it opens up the bishop. It hits the bishop on f4, and we don't actually open up any substantive files or diagonals. Yeah, very tough position. Queen a5, very, very impressive play thus far by our opponent, I have to say. But queen a5 might be inaccurate because it walks into a lot of different types of tactics. So I actually like the look of queen a5 for us. So what do we do? Queen a5, what does queen a5 do? Well, it doesn't do anything immediately, but it pressures the a2 pawn. And that is very, very annoying because we do not want our knight to be the only piece that stands between us and checkmate. We want to be a lot safer than that if possible. And there is a move which caters to the defensive needs of the position. This is a move you should be automatically considering anytime that you castle, which is, of course, king to b1. And let's play it. Yeah, let's play king b1. Now, as it turns out, king b1 also poses a hidden tactical threat, which increases the appeal of this move for me. There's a devilish tactical idea that we're threatening this move right now, and it wins a bunch of pawns. Yeah, so another theme that reoccurs in a lot of openings when the queens are in a standoff, particularly on this diagonal, there's this idea of knight takes d5. Classic discovery concept. Okay, our opponent missed it, but wait a second, because this is not as simple as it may seem. We play knight takes d5. Black can't take the knight because they lose the queen, right? So after knight d5, black has to play queen takes d2. You might say, well, okay, then we have to take the queen, and black, of course, takes on d5, and black is up a piece. But there's the rub. After knight takes d5, queen takes d2, we can go on and take the pawn on e7, another intermediate move. And only after the king moves do we recapture the queen on d2, and we're up 2 pawns. Now, in that resulting position, it's not as straightforward as it may seem, because that knight on e7 is virtually trapped. And black could try to win that knight with rook c to e8, for example. But I feel like tactically we'll be able to find a way to evacuate the knight. My intuition says that we will be able to find some move. Maybe that counterattacks our maybe g5 to get the d5 square open for our knight. It doesn't seem to me that black will be able to win the knight cleanly. But it's, it's a little bit dicey. But let's see. Let me think. Okay. Let's take the plunge. Let's take the plunge. I can almost guarantee you that black missed this move. I would be beyond impressed if he saw all of this and then found some way to trap the knight. I don't think so. I really don't think so. No. So this is an important point. Queen takes d2, knight takes f6 is a very common blunder. Super common blunder because black actually recaptures with the pawn. Okay, and then the pawn attacks the knight on e5. You're assuming that black has to recapture with the bishop, then everything is chill. But no, black takes back with the pawn and we lose our knight. And I could probably show you some examples of IRL players blundering that kind of concept. There is another very important tactical detail that you have to bear in mind. It's actually in our favor that the rook is on f8. And I'll explain why after the game. Funny thing is we could also play knight takes g6 and cash in our knight for like a bunch of pawns. But there's no need to do that now. We could do that, in an emergency scenario. Let's recapture the queen. And of course, this rook is also hanging. Don't forget that when a lot of exchanges happen, it's a very common time to blunder because a lot of people, they forget to sort of update their perception of the board. For example, the rook on c8 is a piece that would often be blundered. Okay, rook d8, great move. I think that is the most testing move. So let me think about this for a second. Of course, the downside of taking on d8 is that after rook takes d8, black is threatening checkmate on t1, so he forces us to burn another tempo on moving our bishop there. And I don't see a great spot for the bishop. And then our knight could end up in a lot of trouble. Although I do have a really interesting idea. So it involves taking on d8, and then playing bishop to h3. Then I assume our opponent will attack our knight with rook e8, and then I wanted to go g5. But yeah, I actually like the look of that. It's super hard to calculate, and yeah, but the problem is in that resulting position, we might win black's knight back, but black is going to take one of our pawns back, and I want to try to keep our 2 extra pawns, if at all possible. I don't like knight takes g6. Because black just takes. And after knight takes g6, king moves, and again, our rook is hanging. So we can take f8, but black takes the rook on d2. So when all is said and done, we don't really gain anything. So let's go for my idea, because we're running short of time. So rook takes d8, There's also rook to d4, which is what's called a collinear move. It's where you put a piece on an intermediate square on the same file. So when 2 pieces are staring at each other, you make a move that's on the same file, but it's not a capture. So rook d4 also looks very interesting to me, actually. Because then already knight takes g6 becomes a serious threat. Then knight takes g6 becomes a very legitimate idea. But that also has to be calculated. And it's a bit of a head-spinning line. Jeez, there's some crazy tactics here. Okay, let's go rook d4. Let's take the plunge. Let's play rook d4. Extremely complicated position, and we actually are short of time. So I might have to do my, put on my GM hat in a couple of moves and really hunker down and play. Yeah, John Nunn, who is a British grandmaster, I think he coined the term collinear move. They can be some of the hardest moves to conceptually to realize that exist, because in your mind, you're like, well, if 2 rooks are staring at each other, either I have to move the rook away from the file or I have to take, but there's like 2 intermediate options. There's the idea of defending a rook, and I did consider the move rook h2 to protect the rook. Didn't like it. But then there's the collinear move, where you move a piece up on the same file, but you don't capture on d8. So double take on g6 and then take the rook on f8. Is that a threat? Sort of. I mean, what do we get? We get 2 more pawns. So we're going to have a grand total of 4 extra pawns and a rook for 2 pieces. That's a big material advantage. So yeah, knight takes g6 is definitely a move to seriously consider. It's not one-sided that we benefit from that, by the way, because black's minor pieces are incredibly active in this position. So giving black more of them and giving us less of them, well, I guess we're not giving black more minor pieces, but removing our own minor pieces from the board may allow black to optimize the activity of his own pieces. Okay, rook d4. Also, what kinds of tactical patterns am I noticing here? Well, one of the hidden patterns that I think most people have forgotten about because the queens are off the board is that the king can still be checkmated in certain cases. So if black plays h takes g4, the move h5 is still often very effective in the endgame because all we really need is this rook on h1. And notice the knight on e7. It's a very bad piece. It's our worst piece, but it's also doing one productive thing, which is that it's taking away the escape square from the black king. So if you're big into like mating patterns and mates, Anastasia's mate is I'm smelling some Anastasia's mates here if we can get the H file open. If we can get the H file open. And I know people have a lot of questions about specific moves that black can play. Let's wait for our opponent's response, and then after the game we'll, dive a little bit deeper into like some of the moves that are concerning a lot of people. Okay, HG is played. All right. So knight takes g6 is still possible as an emergency option. That's kind of a bailout move. But h5 is very, very attractive to me. Very attractive to me. And it just feels like we emerge ahead in the resulting pandemonium. But maybe not. Maybe I'm miscalculating. I'm largely using my intuition. It just feels like h5 is the move. Let's just do it. What do we have to lose? Let's just do it. So if the knight takes, then we play pawn takes g4. If the knight takes on h5, we play pawn takes g4. That was my idea, at least. And the knight on h5 is pinned. We win the knight. Okay, clearly I'm missing something because our opponent played this instantly. So maybe there's something I failed to see. Let me think about this. So f takes g4. As much as there is going on, everything is protected for the time being. Like, the bishop on f4 is untouchable because the knight is pinned. The rook on d4 is protected by the pawn. The knight on e7 is not being attacked, so it's safe as well. I don't see it. I think we can just play f takes g4. I think we can just do this. Yeah, now, not only are we threatening to take the knight, but when we take the knight, we're also going to be threatening the follow-up h takes g6, and that's essentially checkmate with the rook on h1 opening up. Yeah, so bishop takes g4 here is a way to try to gain some material back. It loses on the spot. Bishop takes g4 loses on... I think black is lost. But what would we do after bishop takes g4? Let's see if you can avoid tunnel vision. Count Chronix says, I think black missed that the knight was pinned. Entirely possible. Bishop takes e5. Yeah, but this doesn't help at all. Yeah, knight takes f7 and rook takes d8. So in response to bishop takes g4, black would have relinquished their defense of the f7 pawn, and then we would have snapped the rook off the board and forked the other rook and the king. So bishop takes e5, obviously. Well, we don't take the knight. That would make no sense because the rook is hanging. We first have to take the bishop with check. Then when the king moves, okay, f6. So now let's try to be very precise because we can take literally anything we want to take right now. This is the fun part. This is where we get to choose which pieces to capture. Now, the simplest option, I think, absolute simplest option, is knight takes g6 check. Because on top of everything else, we also win the rook in the corner. Less accurate would be g takes h5. Because then black plays f takes e5, and you might be attracted to the idea of delivering a discover check, but the king actually runs away to f6. So if you follow the line gh, fe, hg, king g7, rook h7, it's not mate because the king has f6. Why not rook takes d8? Because then black plays rook takes d8. And we could also play, by the way, bishop takes f6 check might be even stronger. Yeah, bishop f6 check might be the best move, actually. I just realized that this exists because the knight is pinned, and if the rook takes, we take d8 with check, and then recapture the knight. Yeah, bishop f6 or knight g6. Literally choose your pick. It's totally winning either way, where we win a crap ton of material. But let's play elegantly. In the spirit of the Jobava, we'll play the elegant move. Yeah, total feast. Rook takes f6, rook takes d8 check. And then, of course, we pick up the knight. And it's very important that the bishop is protected. It's very important that in the final position, this bishop on f1 is defended by the rook. Okay, the rest is a matter of technique. It's impressive that our knight ends up in the same place it started. It's still on e7. It's perfectly safe. And now we can evacuate it through d5. Another, perhaps sexier way to do this would be to evacuate it through g8 using some tactics. I'm trying to find the fastest win. I'm trying to find the way to mate here. But I don't see it. I don't see a mate. I think we should just play it simple and just go like knight d5. Very, very, plain vanilla meat and potatoes strategy. Just get your knight out of the danger zone and your upper rook. Not everything has to be, tactically crazy, well calculated. You can play simple chess, especially when you're up material. And then our knight is maneuvering to f4, where it's on a perfect defended square and it's pressuring h5. Rook f5. Okay, knight f4. This is a very nice outpost for the knight. And we're going to eliminate black's last passed pawn. Yeah, this is resignable, completely resignable. Okay, we can play, again, I always say this when we reach these types of positions, which is that, you know, there's going to be like 5 or 7 or even more equivalently good moves. It's totally a matter of taste how you convert such a position when it's this winning. I like to go for checkmate and go for more material. Some people, they put the emphasis on trading pieces. So something like bishop d3 would be a good move. I want to deliver the check on g1 because I want to hunt this king down. Maybe unsuccessfully. But this move feels right. Okay, well, what do we do here? Bishop d3. Now, I don't see a mating net, unfortunately. I just don't see a mating pattern here. We don't need Luft right now. I mean, we could play b3. Could play b3 if you're paranoid, but there's no even hypothetical back rank right now, so black has no pieces left with which to deliver the back rank mate. All right, let's give another check. Let's give another check. Okay. King e7. And now I'm going to slide the rook over to h6. And I am going to put the rook behind the pawn. Maybe the rook h7 to follow and then bring the bishop out. One way or something's going to give. Something's going to go. Okay, knight e4, the first thing I see is that it aligns the knight and the rook. So without further thinking, let's go bishop d3. And force exchanges. Okay, knight c2 check. King obviously goes to c1 in order to attack the knight simultaneously. Now, again, we have a choice. We can play bishop takes f5 and simplify. But if we wanted to go for more material, if we wanted to just win all of black's pieces, which is what I want to do, we go rook g3. The only thing I would recommend is that you don't automatically just trade. I mean, sometimes if you can win a minor piece, that's better. I guess black has knight h4, but then we go rook h3. Yeah. No, this is not a trade. I'm saying we could have, if we wanted to, taken on f5 and traded the rooks. That is a form of a trade. It's just an unconventional trade. We'll definitely have a good amount to look at after the game. Oh, yeah, missed the rook on g1. Okay, yeah, so that's why we moved the rook up. Now our opponent resigns. Okay, I appreciate it. All right. So let's, first and foremost, I'm going to open up the course. And I definitely confused something. I definitely got something wrong in the opening. I can feel it. Because the position we got was complicated and interesting, but it didn't feel like the, you know, it didn't just have that sense that it was the line we were recommending. Oh, yeah. I freaked out. This is the main line. I apologize to everybody on YouTube. This has been a long day. I had a complete mental breakdown. The move here is 95. This is literally the main line that we recommend. And we have some incredible analysis here. So I just confused the position. For some reason, I forgot that we don't have to react to c5. We can just do our thing. And I'll show you some of the main lines after 95 in a second. So a quick sort of overview of the g6 variation. e3, bishop g7, and h4. Yes, indeed, we want to play the move h5. So if black, for instance, plays a6, which is a move that we analyze, we already play h5. We play h5. And after knight h5, rook takes h5, gh, queen h5. Not only does white have full compensation for the exchange, we believe that black's position, I don't want to say lost, but practically I think it's close to lost already. Now, why is that? Why is white like so much better here? Well, there's many, many reasons. Of course, there's like the concrete reasons, which is that d5 is hanging, d5 has to be defended because that's the center pawn and we're going to take it with our knight. And a really cool line is after e6 to defend the pawn, we have an amazing move. This is such a lovely move. Let's see who can find it. That's all I'm going to say is that it's a lovely move. You should pause it on YouTube if you don't have the course, of course. White to play and win some more material. And this is such a typical idea in these types of positions. Jobava himself kind of coined this move. No, g4 is Bishop c7 doesn't work. It just blunders a bishop. But you're on the right track. Not queen g4. That's a one-move threat. Black can defend against that. So you actually can win the c7 pawn here. Yeah, very good. Sussy Baka got it. Queen to h2. Out of nowhere, you build this battery, and it turns out black cannot defend c7. Because you can't move the pawn, you drop the knight. Now, why is c7 important? Well, this move is good not just because it attacks c7. Also, the queen is very safe on h2. And one of the other reasons that black is in such trouble is that he can never castle. Black can never castle because the king is going to get massacred on the king side here with all these open files and diagonals. Well, first of all, you can play bishop c7 and bishop takes b8. But even if you didn't have that, you could play bishop d3, knight f3, knight g5. You could castle and put a rook on h1, and this pawn is incredibly weak. So I don't want to belabor the point here. c6 is our main move in the course. c6 is our main move, and here white just develops. Knight f3, and if knight d7, white already wins the game with knight g5. And look at this line, rook f8. Now white has a very prosaic tactic, knight to e6, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop. But after queen a5, there's an even better move than knight takes bishop check. You go bishop c7, and you actually win the entire queen because you're threatening now knight takes g7, checkmate. And black can't even get a bishop for the queen because then you win the rook. So if you're a Jobava player, this is one of the fundamental ideas that you should be familiar with in the g6 line, which is the move h4. And this is one of the typical ideas that I show in the typical ideas database. Now, black, of course, has many ways to respond to this move. The most popular move on Lichess is h5. The second most popular is, in fact, a castle kingside. And as you can probably guess, the move here is h5. And now a ton of people walk into this trap where they go bishop g4 and they say, oh, let me pick up this with a bishop so that he can't sack the exchange. Well, this is terrible because of f3. And you always have to remember that when you fianchetted the bishop, the other bishop doesn't have this retreating square. So g4 picks it up. If knight takes h5, we analyze this in tremendous depth, but this is completely one-sided position. White is crushing here. For example, c6 bishop d3, f5 knight f3. Remember, you just develop your pieces. And after queen e8, hopefully, if you've been paying attention, you already know what white's move is. What white's move is. It is, in fact, queen h2. Dropping the queen away with tempo, attacking the knight. And that tempo is then generated to castle kingside and queenside and quickly get a rook to h1. And even if you're not experienced in this opening, I think you can be able to tell that the attack on h7, the coordination of white's pieces, the domination over e5 is totally disgusting here. Black is busted. It's like +4. So you're going to win a lot of games like this, castles in h5. Okay, so on we go to our opponent's move. We also analyze h6. In the course, we try to look at almost every common move. But let's focus on h5 for now. So now we continue with our development. Knight f3. Our opponent castles, queen d2. This is the main line of our course. And c5 is the most common move. And here I had a complete meltdown. For some reason, I forgot that this was the main line, and I played DC, which is a move that Bortnyk and I analyzed, but it, in fact, is refuted with knight bd7. So huge kudos to our opponent. He did find the correct response to DC, which is not easy. Knight bd7 is not an easy move, in my opinion, because it also seems to hang the d5 pawn. So it's just something that black has to know. And if black doesn't find knight bd7, I think white is probably better. What is the correct move instead? The correct move is to position the knight on e5, which is exactly what we did in the game, except we did it after we played DC, which is obviously a concession, right? You don't want to give away this pawn or move it away from d4 if you can help it. And after knight e5, black's most common response in this position is knight to c6. At any point, black can also play cd, ed. That doesn't change all that much. In fact, it allows us to later play bishop h6. So the GMs play knight c6 here. And now we execute the same idea that we did in the game. We play f3. Basically, we combine the idea of g4 with play on the queen side. Another very typical, I wouldn't call it typical, another classic concept in the Jobava is play on both sides of the board, where you set up attacking ideas on the king side, but you don't restrict yourself to just playing on the king side. You also aim for positional domination on the other side of the board. Which is pretty mind-expanding when you look at some of these lines. For example, so if black plays cd, ed, which is the main line, usually black takes this pawn at this point. Giri against Bortnyk. So Sasha had this 3 Title Tuesdays ago against Anish Giri, who played the move queen to b6 and got a lost position in 5 moves. Watch. White, of course, castles queenside. That's the whole point, protecting d4 and b2. Now Anish plays bishop to f5. And as you already know, what is white's move in this position? Who can tell me what the time has come to do? Exclam course for the link to my course. G4? Yeah, of course, G4, HG, H5. Now, it's not intuitively apparent to most people why this is in fact so strong. And I could analyze this for an hour. There's a lot of concrete tactics here. One of the main ideas to remember is that if black plays GF and ignores, you shove this pawn down to h6. And you say, well, this is counterproductive, right? We want to remove this pawn from the board. And of course, that's why you play h7. And if king g7, bishop h6 is mating, so black has to take on h7. This is absolutely and utterly crushing. You can actually throw in the move knight takes d5 here and hit the queen. And then, of course, you get down to business. Queen h2, g5. And the last hurdle that has to be crossed, this bishop on f5 has to be eliminated. If it's eliminated, then checkmate on the h file is inevitable, and that's how you find bishop d3, getting rid of the bishop. Black can resign. It's made in like 2 moves. After h5, black has to respond to this threat. But there's not a lot of ways in which black can do that. If black plays knight takes h5, then you play f takes g4, forking these minor pieces. And that's not the end of the line, but it's incredibly unpleasant for black. If black plays gh, then you play fg, continuing to try to open up files on the king side. hg is just awful because it opens up the h file and allows us to stick a queen on h2. And this is just winning for white. Probably more accurate, actually, is even to go bishop h6 here. Yeah, bishop h6 is just winning. Because the queen is coming to g5. I mean, you're threatening 600 different mates. So in this position, our main move in the file is g takes h5, f takes g4, h takes g4. Sorry, bishop to d3. This is the clinical move. This is the clinical move. And after bishop d3, knight d3, everything is finally ready for us to put our queen on h2. So knight takes d4. We come back to e5 first to centralize the knight. And finally, we move the queen over to h2. And black is in huge trouble. Rook dg1 and knight takes g4 is coming. Knight takes d5 is a huge threat. Nobody on earth is going to be able to defend this position. So this is examples of attacking on the king side. What about the queen side? In which cases do we transition the focus over to the other side of the board? After knight c6 f3, the best move according to our analysis is not queen b6 after cd ed. It's actually bishop f5. And here g4 is premature. As a good rule of thumb, you don't normally play g4 until you have castled queenside. But if you castle queenside here, then black has this very unpleasant move, knight to b4. Black has this very unpleasant move, knight to b4. And now c2 is under fire, and you don't want to go bishop d3 and give away the light squared bishop, which is an integral piece. Instead, you actually play this move, which is not intuitively apparent that it's good. You play bishop b5, and you put pressure on the knight on c6. Now, it's not that black has no way to defend the knight. The problem is that if black defends the knight with a natural move like rook c8, and the same thing, by the way, happens in response to queen b6. If somebody has read the course or purchased the course, let's see who can tell me what incredibly thematic positional idea on the queen side allows us to completely freeze all of black's play on the queen side. After this sequence, black is helpless on the queen side. And it involves 2 steps. Step 1 is to do what in this position? This is a purely positional idea. Don't look for tactics. Knight takes c6 does win an exchange. Excellent, but it's bad. Black can sack the exchange there for compensation. Yeah, you play bishop takes c6, and then you play knight c3 to a4. Knight c3 to a4. I call this the Rubinstein idea. This doesn't have a formal name. I call this the Rubinstein idea over a game that I have already shown on stream, actually quite recently, but let me jog your memory. Akiva Rubinstein, if you're watching on YouTube and you haven't heard of him, look him up, read his Wikipedia page. One of the best players of the early 20th century. Never became world champion, but probably the greatest positional player of the early 1900s. He understood so many concepts that people of his time were totally clueless about, and that included blockade and how to deal with weak pawns. Okay, why do I call this the Rubinstein idea? Because this idea of blocking the c5 square when there is a c6 pawn was very famously applied by Rubinstein in a game that he played, that Russian chess coaches really liked showing this game to students. We have this position in the game Rubinstein against Salve. And as you can probably guess, you can guess what Rubinstein played here. The way this pawn structure arose, this was an IQP, isolated queen pawn. Rubinstein traded on c6, reaching what's called the hanging pawn structure. And now, of course, he played what move? He played knight to a4. And the point of all of his subsequent moves is to create a full blockade on the c5 square. Why would you do that? Well, because you can almost think of the c6 pawn as an isolated pawn, which it sort of is. Not technically, because it does have a neighboring pawn, but pawns don't go backwards. So c6, I guess, is a backward pawn. That's how we would refer to it properly. And your technique for dealing with some of these backward pawns is the same as with an isolated pawn. You blockade the square in front of it to make it impossible for your opponent to eradicate the weakness of that pawn. And watch what Rubinstein does. Bishop e3. Now, if you're paying attention, the next move should be very natural to you. Rook c1. Now he's got 3 different pieces on the c5 square. Salve tries to get some counterplay with bishop g4. He sends the bishop away. And then, finally, everything is ready. We can occupy the square with our bishop. And here, he puts into practice an incredible plan. So he carries out an amazing idea that made a big impression on me when I was a kid. The next 3 moves, or next 4 moves. It's not enough to blockade the square in front of the pawn. You also eventually have to win the pawn. And you don't win a pawn by simply blockading it. You need to add a little bit of juice to the c-file. So you might think, well, let's play queen c2. But leading with a queen is usually not a very good idea when you're stacking pieces on a file. So the ideal scenario is, of course, to get the rook from f1 somehow over to c2, for example. And Rubinstein finds a very efficient way to do that. He goes rook f2. Knight d7 by Salve. Okay, they trade. Now, already you have to be very alert because black threatens to go c5. So first he puts the queen on d4 again to prevent the motion of the pawn. Now he plays bishop f1 to activate the bishop. And in order to accomplish both of these things with the move e3. Now he's activating the bishop. And finally, he is ready, after the trade of knights, to move the rook from f2 to c2. And he's achieved his plan. And with the 2 rooks aiming at c5, he can now push his b-pawn up the board and basically tear black apart on the c-file. And he ends up winning a couple of games. He ends up winning the game in a couple of moves. So there's a nice tactic that occurs a little bit later. After a6, he goes rook a5. So now that the pawn is on b4, you don't need a piece on c5 anymore. And after rook b8, a3, Salve panics with rook a... Well, not panics. He's already lost. He plays rook a7. Let's see who can find White's game-winning tactic. This wins material. And this is such a poetic culmination of his entire strategy because, well, you'll see why. It's an easy move. Well, I used ChessBase to find this game fast. I knew when it was played. Yeah, rook takes c6. Excellent. So you win the pawn. It took him like 15 moves, but he wins the pawn and wins another one, and he wins the game in just 8 more moves. So that's why I refer to this concept as the Rubinstein technique, where you blockade the c5 square, and the Jobava, it's incredibly common across many different lines. Back to the speedrun game. So, of course, when we do this thing, when we play knight a4, we're not restricting ourselves from playing g4. In fact, if you follow the course, after knight a4, the main line goes knight to d7. Okay, knight to d7, trying to trade off the knight from e5. You say, okay, I'm happy to trade. Now you stick a knight on c5. Now you follow the rule. Don't go g4 until you've castled. Castling is perfectly safe. Black can't even put a rook on the open file. Even that isn't available to him. Black is lost here. It's actually lost. Like, not exaggerating. Because black has no moves. And our next move is just going to be either g4 or the engine just says you have the time to play rook hg1. Because black is so paralyzed, you can actually just prepare g4. You don't even have to sack a pawn and deal with the tactics. But of course, g4, h5 is also very, very strong here as well. But this is a lovely idea, bishop c6. And that's why you play bishop b5. And that is why people who know what to do actually move the knight from c6. So the main line is, in fact, knight takes knight because of this concept. And before I go on, another line in which this is a very common idea is the e6 variation, which is the most common move on Lichess, e6. Here you play knight b5. And there's a line where black plays knight a6 and basically goes c6. And bishop d6. This is a very common way to play. And here you gain an advantage by playing bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, bishop a6, ba, and hopefully you can understand the similarity. Here you're not attacking on the king side, but you still have this incredibly weak c4 square. So actually you can play knight a4 right away. Our move is knight f3, but this is also possible because you have the move c3 here, defending the knight. Another important technique, by the way, to play c3 in response to the check. And again, you have this blockade on c5. The bishop has no prospects, and white is positionally dominating. So this is one of the ideas that I illustrate in the common ideas section. All right, so we go back for a second to this position, instead of rook c8, the main line is knight e5 to e, knight d7. The course goes on for like 10 or 15 more moves. This is an incredibly dangerous position for black, and we found some very, very cool ideas here. I'll just give you the next two moves, which are castles. Knight takes e5, and now not knight takes d5, but rather you go after black's bishop with bishop h6. This is a super cool move, bishop h6 here, which I think reinvigorates the variation. Apologies. First you go rook he1. My bad. You go rook he1 first, kicking the knight away. And then after knight c6, you go bishop h6. And it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous for black. And to analyze more, you can get the course. Long story short, I had a brain fart, and the move here is knight e5, not d takes e5. And after knight bd7, I realized that immediately. So, again, the problem here is that we can't really take on d5. Here we're much worse, because after the trade, black takes on b2, and everybody should understand why this is bad for white. Queen's coming out, bishop's dropping back, and we're not going to be able to castle queenside because we're going to have to move our rook. So instead, we had to do damage control and go knight e5. Knight takes e5 and f3. So we're doing the same thing. It's just we don't have that d4 pawn anymore. Bishop f5 castles. I think our opponent is playing really, really well up until this point. I think bishop e6 is a really, really bad move. And I think it gives us an opportunity to jumpstart our attack. I think if black plays correctly here, he's much better. And the key insight that our opponent had to make is that there is an easy way to defend d5, but indirectly. Bishop e6 is so passive. The bishop on f5 is an amazing piece. So e6, you don't want to go e6 here, because the bishop is kind of trapped in the resulting position. Bishop is kind of trapped in the resulting position. And white has some ideas like e4, de, and queen e3, hitting the knight. It's just a little bit awkward. Yeah, rook c8. I think the best move is rook c8. And what this does is that it creates an x-ray against the c2 pawn and against the king. Knight takes d5 is unthinkable, because perhaps black has a game-winning tactic here, but even a simple move like queen a5, you have to sense that this is just, white is dead here, because there's way too many threats. The queen on d5 is vulnerable. Like, there's 1,000 ways to attack it, and this is just no good. It's like -7. The computer line here is bishop c4. And now simply rook cd8 traps the queen. This literally traps the queen. And if white plays, I don't know, queen d2, then you drop this pawn. But wherever white turns, you're going to blunder either the queen, or you're going to give up a pawn, or you're going to get mated. If you play king b1, again, just rook cd8 is winning. So this is an instructive, really appreciating why black is winning there will help you build your attacking intuition. We would have never taken on d5 here. I probably would have played king to b1 and tried to escape the c file. But this is problematic. I mean, after queen b6, black is really aiming at our king from all sides. And here you're really missing the d4 pawn. Here you can really understand why the d4 pawn is so important, because it shuts the bishop out. It shuts the c5 square out. It disrupts the coordination of black's pieces. Without that pawn, black's attack becomes potentially devastating. I mean, the engine thinks white is borderline lost here. So I probably would have played bishop e2 and tried to go g4 anyway. But black can bring the rook into the game. And there's another problem with g4, which is that if you try to do this here, your pieces are so uncoordinated, and our king is under such fire that black just strikes first. G takes f3, bishop f3, and now knight ce4 is incredibly strong. And we're just not fast enough. If we take it and we go, first of all, black can take just with a pawn. Black can take with a pawn and just win the bishop on f3. So we just don't get off the ground here, because we're under too much strain on the other side of the board. Here you just take c3 and black wins. So that's the issue. Is black just is able to coordinate faster than we're able to get our attack started. Yeah, and white has to kind of hunker down here and just try to defend. Best move apparently is queen to d4, trying to create the preconditions for a queen trade, which would of course favor us. But black can step away with queen a5. And if you play b4, the queen can drop back to b6. Because you can't take the knight, and white has made even more weaknesses on the queen side. Of course, I'm mad at myself for confusing this, but that's why you should never be all that mad at yourself when you're confusing theory and you're just starting an opening. I've been playing this for 7 years, and I've analyzed this line 100 times, and I confused the move. So it just happens, right? You're human, and the most important thing is how you react after you realize that you confuse something. You just have to keep treating it like a regular position. Of course, our opponent gave us a new lease on life. Bishop e6 is really bad, and immediately I struck with g4. Now, our opponent plays queen a5, which I think is inferior to queen b6. I think queen b6 is the best spot for the queen in this position. And a very instructive moment, because a lot of people would automatically take. Don't do that because you allow h5. And now I think white has a huge attack. White has a huge attack. And that attack works in exactly the same way as the lines that I showed you with the pawn on d4. For example, if knight takes h5, we chase the knight away. And after knight takes h4, we can even play queen h2 right away because we're already threatening this devastating mate on h7. If black plays gh, then you always play fg, and you basically try to open up the h-file. That's your ultimate idea. This should start to make sense to people. Like, the mechanism of attack should start to make sense, especially if you're a Sicilian player, especially if you've seen this idea before in the Dragon. White has won so many easy games with this exact concept in the Dragon. I don't have any off the top of my head. But even some main lines actually involve this idea. And not just in the Dragon, and really any opening where a fianchetto happens. Here's a Fischer game that I found. Here's a Bobby Fischer game from the Dragon that I found. Simul game. Just off the top of not off the top of my head, I just did a search, and this is the first game that came up. And I think it's a suitable illustration of this concept. I just like to show different openings where stuff happens so that people get a better sense that these are common patterns, not just, oh, this is this one time. This is what chess improvement is all about. Oh, and this is perfect because it's going to give me an opportunity to also show you why knight d5 is not a good move in certain positions. In this position, there's a queen on a5, a queen on d2. Let's start over. The reason I got excited is because I'm also able to show you why knight d5 is bad in certain positions. Here, after queen d2, knight takes e7 check, the key difference is that black doesn't have a rook on f8. So black can play king f8 and attack the knight, and you have to spend a tempo capturing the queen, and black takes the knight on e7, winning a piece. As I was saying, if you have blundered like this, the best thing to do is desperado sack the knight for another pawn. But black has, a piece for 2 pawns, so this is obviously bad. Now, if you did this, you should probably take f6, but this is just a trade. You don't really accomplish anything with this. So don't play knight d5 automatically. You have to actually test it concretely. Instead, Fischer goes h4. Black goes h5, and you know the drill. g4 and h5. Black plays gh. Now Fischer eliminates the knight, which is a key defender of the king side. He takes g4, and he brings his rook to g1. And now the pressure down these 2 files is totally overwhelming. Queen is shifted, no queen trade. And now, as I was saying, he involves the knight. He involves the knight via the center and uses the knight to deflect the queen. Queen takes c7, there's rook takes h5, and the bishop on g4 is lost, and then mate is following after that. So black can't take the knight. Knight swings back and joins the attack, and then goes all the way back to e3 in order to hit the bishop. And after bishop d4, it's tactics time. Rook takes g4 is an easy liquidation into a winning endgame. Because if black plays queen e3, he gets ladder mated. Black can't take with a pawn. Black has to take with a queen. And when the smoke clears, Fischer's also going to pick up the h-pawn. This is a completely winning endgame. 2 pieces for a rook in this kind of situation is black is dead in the water here. So, not the greatest illustration, but it shows you that these ideas are fairly ubiquitous. g4 and h5. Idea is to just open up a bunch of files, and then you bring your rooks and your queen into the game, and often that leads to checkmate. Rook a c8. Here, the chief difference is that there is a rook on f8. I hope everybody understands that. Knight takes d5. Queen takes d2. Of course, we didn't analyze. I suppose we didn't analyze hg, but I don't really want to analyze it. I think. Oh, no, we did look at it. We did look at it briefly. Clearly, this is good for white. You can take a closer look on your own if you're interested. But I want to get to the game. Rook a c8, knight takes d5. And, of course, queen takes d2. So, now, to reiterate, knight takes f6 check, folks, allows e takes f6. And I could go on a whole tangent about, unconventional pawn recaptures. This is a whole category of moves, which basically involves a situation where you assume that the natural capture is forced, but then suddenly your opponent takes with a pawn. This is a very straightforward illustration. Here, it's obvious why you take with a pawn because you win the knight. But there are some incredible positional illustrations of this concept. One of the most famous involves a game between Vasily Ivanchuk and Vishy Anand, who played a match in 1992 in Linares. And this is an incredibly famous game. I'll just show you the start of it. Belabor the point, I promise. But I think you'll enjoy this. Another game which my coach showed me as a kid, and it just made a big impression on me for some reason. This is positional, so don't expect tactics here. This is purely positional. In this position, Vasily Ivanchuk has the white side of a Sicilian, right? And he decides that, okay, black's attack is quite strong. He decides that black's attack is quite strong here. B4 is being threatened. He says, let's bail out. And he says, let's bail out. And he bails out with, of course, the move knight to d5, which is the move we're talking about. Okay. Anand has no choice but to take the queen, and the whole point is that he takes on f6 check first. Black has to take with the bishop. He takes on d2 and basically offer a draw. This is just an equal endgame. What do you think we're missing in this conversation? What am I deliberately leaving out? What happened in the game? Let's see who can. Yeah. So knight f6 gf. Now, why on earth would you ruin your own pawn structure like this? Well, it is the top engine move, and black is better. And there's a very specific tactic or positional reason why you play g takes f6. And it's all about the next move. Let's see if anybody can understand why gf is played. And if you find the next move, then it starts to make sense. Very good. Axel, you deserve a sub. You got it. The point is to play h5. Am I looking? I don't get why is this so good, and why couldn't you have done this after bishop f6? Well, the second question is easy to answer. If you play h5 here, well, first of all, d6 hangs. Second of all, white can just shut down the king side with g5 and h4. Big deal. So clearly, you can't do either of those things in this case. g5 is not possible. The pawn on d6 is defended. You also can't play h3 because black has tactics, takes, and h1 hangs. So white actually has no choice but to ruin his own structure. Ivanchuk played rook g1. He didn't want to take because in the resulting position, black develops huge pressure on h2 and can also push the pawn down to f5 and start developing pressure in the center. So he goes rook g1. He gives black an open file. And now another incredible move, bishop c4. This is another move which is like, wow, you're weakening all the light squares. For white doesn't have a knight to put on those light squares. And if white trades bishops, then black opens up the b file, and black is also threatening the move c3 and rook h3, and white's pawns are super weak, and the whole position just falls apart for white. The whole position falls apart for white. And that's what happens in the game. Anand infiltrates h3. Then he brings his king out to the center, and the most important thing to understand in this entire equation is, A, that pawn structure is overrated. I say that often, and the reason I say that is because you cannot just look at a structure and say, well, this is bad or this is good. It's visually very ugly, but black's pawns are incredibly well defended, all of them by either the bishop. They can also be easily defended by a king from e7. So the bottom line here is that g takes f6 is not as radical of a move as it may appear. Because, in fact, this structure arises pretty often in a Najdorf, and black is fine. And you get massive kingside pressure. He wins the game in the end. Yeah, in the Rouser, this happens quite frequently. I could spend longer on this game, but I don't want any speedrun video to go longer than an hour. So let's finish off by taking a look at whether our opponent could have found something more testing in this position. Rook takes d2, rook c to d8. In response to rook c to e8, probably we would have taken on g7. And that is why I actually think king h7 is a better move. I think king h7 is better. Because now you can play rook c e8. And we don't have knight takes g6. Or king h8 was incredibly sloppy. It was super sloppy. King h7 was the move. And in this position, I had to find the key move, because otherwise we lose our knight. And I said this during the stream, so you guys should know what move I was planning here. The move is g5. Counterattacking black's knight. If the knight moves, then, well, we can evacuate our knight to d5. Here we should probably take first. And then the knight safely evacuates to d5. What should black do? Well, probably black should play rook e7 and snag a pawn. Remember, we were up 2 pawns, so now we're just up a full pawn in the endgame. And white is winning. I mean, we're better. We're up a pawn. And I don't think black has any realistic compensation. So that's what we were planning in response to rook e8. Now let's go to the game. Our opponent played the sloppy move king h8, which gave us additional resources. Now, if black plays rook e8, now I think we would have taken on g6. Now we would have definitely taken on g6, because in the resulting position, I mean, just look at this. We have a 4-on-1, for God's sake. I don't know, bishop b5, then g5. Our pawns are just running black over. This is completely winning for white. So this eliminates that option. Rook d8 happened. And here, I was actually really proud of this move, rook to d4, because it keeps the tension and it keeps all of the advantages of the position while keeping this rook on a ultra safe square, right? Best square is a square that's protected by a pawn. And collinear moves, another tangent that I could go on. I think we've gotten enough for this game. So just keep this in mind, right? Rook to d4, collinear move, putting the rook on the same file but on a defended square. I have a good example of collinear move, but I won't show one right now. And here I think our opponent makes the decisive mistake. Yeah, I checked with the engine, and after h5, white is winning on the spot. This is over. This is game over. Because if instead of knight takes h5, which our opponent played, and here we can stop the analysis, because here we just win all of black's pieces. If instead black would have played gh, we would have played in exactly the same way that we do when the queens are on the board. We play fg. And black is busted because there's no way to keep h5 protected. If bishop takes g4, then again, we don't have to play knight takes g4. We can just win the rook. We can just do this. Tunnel vision, right? Avoiding tunnel vision. If black plays rook d to e8, which is the top engine move, we can actually play g takes h5 and shove this pawn down to h6, and black can resign. Did I? Yeah, I switched scenes this time. Now I'm scared. And that's it. So the fatal mistake was h takes g4. According to the engine, black has to... Sorry, not this move. According to the engine, black has to play king h7, which nobody on earth is going to play. And it's already bad. It's already bad. We bring our bishop out. Black has no good way to attack the knight. So I would say that this decision to play king h8 rather than king h7 is really what did black in. Had our opponent played the immediate king h7, he would have had the time to either hit the knight or play rook cd8. And if we compare this position to the one after king h8, here black has this additional move, rook de8, and white doesn't have knight takes g6, right? We have to go with this move again, and black has knight fd7. Actually, black wins an exchange here, because after the trade, we can't protect our rook and our knight at the same time, so we sack the exchange by defending the knight, and white is still better in the resulting position because we have two pawns, and we've got a lot of the dark squares, and we have d5 coming, but black can definitely defend here. Like, I wouldn't be confident I'd beat Magnus in this position. So... in any case, this was a sloppy move, and then obviously allowing h5, and after f takes g4, the game is simply over. We take all of black's pieces. Okay, so that concludes the analysis. In summary, of course, this was unfortunate. I messed up the move order. I played dc, which is a big mistake because of knight b to d7. It's good to know. The move here is knight e5. I illustrated some typical ideas in the g6 variation. Hopefully that encourages you to buy the course, even though I confused the move. I got like the first move wrong. The course is in the link, and we'll play maybe one or two more Jobava games. I'll show some more cool lines, but it happens. Yeah, you know, everybody confuses stuff from time to time. The important thing is that we reacted well to it, but if our opponent had avoided playing passively with bishop e6 and had played rook c8, we would have been in very, very serious trouble. So it's not an opening that you play if you're not willing to take risks. But then again, what are you doing at the chessboard if you're unwilling to take risks? Thank you all for supporting and subscribing.